Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 56, Parents. "It's okay, Ruby," she said to herself nervously as she approached the tent, anxiously tapping her fingers together. "They're probably done already." Who was she kidding? It had only been 4 hours. That wasn't even as many hours as years since the fondest girl had last seen her parents. There was likely still plenty of things for them to talk about. And if she had her way, then she would leave them to talk without interruption. However, much to her dismay, Saber had ordered her to update Blake's dad on progress with the cart and to inform the chieftain that he was awake. It was not something Ruby was especially happy about, but she had promised Ashvin that they would follow every order the man gave. However, as she approached, she heard something that made her stop. The unmistakable sound of someone crying was coming from the tent, and Ruby was able to place that sound anywhere. She hated hearing it almost a week ago, and she hated it just as much now. Hated hearing how much pain her girlfriend was in, but at least she was finally getting it all out. She had already punished herself enough, and was doing everything she could to make things right. Sadly though, Blake didn't feel the same, and no matter what Ruby tried to tell her, the girl wouldn't change her mind. Ruby hoped that the girl's parents would be able to convince her that she didn't deserve to be punished anymore, but from the sounds of it, they weren't having much luck either. So with a sad, she reached out and went to slowly pull aside the tarp that covered the entrance. Before she could though, she felt a presence to her left beside the tent and turned to see who it was, only to be met with nothing. The area was empty, but she could definitely feel something watching her. It took a second, but she suddenly realized that it was the same feeling she'd had that morning and wondered if the girl with the invisibility semblance was lurking around again. Unfortunately, she wasn't anywhere near as good as Blake or Fox with sensing aura, so knew she would be unable to locate the girl, though she supposed that was a good thing. After all, she was probably hiding for a reason. So simply giving the empty space a smile, just as she had done that morning, she turned back to the tent and carefully lifted aside the flap. Mr. Belladonna," she asked, not looking inside just yet. Sorry for interrupt dash." "You may enter, Miss Rose," his kind voice replied. Once again wishing that she didn't have to interrupt the precious family time of her girlfriend, Ruby took a deep breath and shook away the nerves. Sticking her head through the canvas, she was greeted by the Belladonna family sitting around the map table. While Gyra looked as he always did, though slightly more tired, his wife looked uncomfortable. Her amber eyes that were so like Blake were filled with shame as she looked on her daughter. Blake, however, was much worse. Not only were her eyes painfully red, she was shaking and sniffling, her hands wrapped tightly into balls as she stared down at them, seemingly refusing to meet anybody's gaze. Once again, Ruby felt a wave of sympathy rush through her. She knew how hard it must be for the girl to face her parents again and explain herself, and wanted nothing more than to give her a hug and tell her everything was going to be okay. But she wasn't sure it was right for her to be there any longer than she needed to be. "How can I help, Miss Rose?" Gyra said, standing up and pouring more tea for his wife and daughter. "Oh." Starting slightly, she looked away from her girlfriend and back up at the man. Saber told me to tell you that he is awake and ready to discuss tomorrow's journey. He also wanted me to tell you that the cart is almost ready. My sister is just finishing up the brakes, and then we can put it together." Good. The man nodded and pushed one of the drinks towards Blake. "I thank you and your team for the help with this. Leaving our supplies behind would have been detrimental." "It's fine." Ruby nodded sheepishly, glancing down at her girlfriend again and seeing her look away from the cup. "We're happy to help Blake's family, but I should get dash." "Actually," Callie interrupted and pulled her own drink towards herself. "Would you be so kind as to stay?" "Oh, I'm not sure that would be a good idea." "Please," the woman said, her voice becoming more firm. "You are clearly someone our daughter is comfortable around, and this has been a very trying day for her. A familiar face may help her with this final part." Still unsure as amber eyes locked onto hers, Ruby glanced sideways at her girlfriend in search of permission. After all, this way Blake's reunion, and she didn't want to intrude. After a couple of seconds, however, the girl gave an almost imperceptible nod, and Ruby quickly pulled a nearby stool over to sit beside her. "Fetch the girl another glass, dear," the woman said to her husband, turning back to Blake as the man got up and walked over to a chest on the other side of the tent. "Now, you were saying something about a farm?" Realizing exactly what part of Blake's past the girl was reliving, Ruby instantly reached out and took her girlfriend's hand underneath the table. For almost a minute, it was unresponsive, but as Gyra returned with the aforementioned glass and filled it up, Ruby felt the hand turn and latch onto hers with a grip so tight that she activated her aura to dull the pain. For the next 30 minutes, Ruby sat there in silence as Blake told the story that had been written in the diary. Unlike the diary, however, Ruby felt quite a bit more uncomfortable. The words on the page had felt so distant, so unsure that the weight of what had happened had felt lessened. Listening to Blake, however, it was clear just how painful a memory that day was for her. Though she told it without pause, it almost felt like she was trying to get it all out without throwing up. With each new sentence, the girl's hand would grip hers tighter, and the shaking would increase even more. Unfortunately, Ruby could do nothing more than hold her hands. Though she wanted to embrace the girl and tell her that everything would be okay, so didn't want to potentially invite a different conversation into the room. Nor did she want to interrupt and cause Blake to spend even longer telling a story that she hated. So while it wasn't much, she held onto her girlfriend's hand and repeatedly squeezed back to make sure Blake understood she wasn't alone. Eventually, though, the girl reached the end of her story, though it had definitely not ended as she expected. Blake had never told them about the train heist she'd been a part of, nor that Adam had been there when she left. As she told them about cutting the card free, of watching him fade into distance, Ruby could hear the fear in her voice. She couldn't imagine how it must have felt to leave, couldn't imagine how it would feel to leave an entire life behind, even if it was a life she hated. "That is," Gyra let out a sad sigh and swirled his tea around. "Quite a story. I know it wasn't easy, but thank you for being honest with us." The mentally anguished girl merely sniffled and gave a small nod. "This is all our fault," Callie mumbled, tracing a part of the map with her finger. "We should have stopped you. Should have brought you back home where you belonged." Now, dear," Gyra said in a soothing voice, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. "It wouldn't have been right for us to force our views on her. Everyone should be free to find their own path, not confined to follow the paths of those that came before." "I know, dear," the woman breathed with uncertainty in her voice. "But everything that happened was part of a journey that Blake chose," he said with regret in his voice. "What happened is regrettable, but just as her mind led her to darkness, her heart led her to light." He turned away from his wife and gave his daughter a proud look. "That kind of journey breeds experience that cannot be taught. It must be lived." Ruby couldn't help but scowl at that. Though she knew it definitely wasn't her place to be questioning how people raise their kids, she had always believed that parents were supposed to keep their kids from harm, to keep them from making mistakes that would haunt them forever. So to hear Gyra talk about how it was a good thing that Blake was left to find her own path irked her a little. "And if she didn't?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she felt her face heat up as Ever-Eye turned to look at her. Thankfully, neither Callie nor Gyra seemed angry, though Blake did look surprised. "We had the utmost confidence that she would," Gyra smiled. "I know our methods may seem strange, Miss Rose, maybe even a little callous, but choosing one's own path has always been encouraged in the Belladonna family. While we do offer guidance and knowledge as best we can, the actions we chose must always be our own." That still didn't sound right to Ruby. I disagree." "As is your right," the man said with a kind smile. Though the man didn't seem angry, Ruby chose not to reply out of worry that might change. However, she was beginning to see what Blake had meant the night before when she had called her parents passive. "So where did you go after that, dear?" Callie said, breaking the momentary silence and pulling the focus back to Blake. Glancing back over to her girlfriend, Ruby caught her eyes, and for a moment she thought she saw gratitude in them. Before she could be sure, though, the girl turned back to the table and took a shuddering breath. "Back to a previous camp," Blake replied quietly, lifting her tea with shaky hands and taking a sip. "I'd hidden some stuff there when I started having doubts. Then I traveled a little. Nowhere in particular, just village to village, before ending up at Beacon. It seemed like the best place to start making things right." "And things have been good at Beacon?" Callie asked curiously. Out the corner of her eye, Ruby saw Blake give her a small look and offered a smile in return. Even as the girl gave her mom a nod, Ruby felt pride and happiness rush through her and a warmth took a hold of her cheeks. I love it there. I have friends, and I feel safe. And we love having her there, Ruby said, raising a hand to pick up her tea, forgetting that she was still holding Blake's. Almost instantly, Callie's eyes fell to them, and then darted back and forth between them. Knowing that she was likely blushing already, she dropped her hand back underneath the table. Unfortunately, the woman's eyes had already widened and filled realization. Oh, I see, she said, a flicker of a smile appearing in the corner of her mouth. See what, dear? Gyra said, seemingly having noticed nothing. A discussion for another time. The woman smiled, placing a hand on his arm. I'm just glad you had friends at Beacon that could help you deal with this. Yes, Gyra agreed with his wife. But you could have called us too. We've never been angry about that day, or held it against you in any way. I thought you would. Blake's ears were flat against her head. The things I said. You were right to say, Callie said, and took her daughter's hand which had been gripping the cup. We don't deny that our approach to peace and unity is more passive than some would like, but it is our view on the world. We never expected it to be yours too, and always understood that you might think differently. Yes, the things you said hurt, but they were how you felt, and we can't be angry at you for expressing yourself. Now that was definitely something Ruby could agree with. In truth, it was something she wished Blake did more of herself. Though the girl had definitely become more expressive in recent months, there were still quite a few occasions where she remained aloof and reserved, especially regarding her hobbies and interests. However, on the rare occasion that she did talk about them, she would always do so with a wide smile that Ruby hoped she would one day see all the time. Callie is right, the man said in a sad tone. We would have reached out ourselves, but we were unsure whether your feelings about us had changed. Or, well, how to even do so. You didn't see her in the Vital tournament? Ruby asked curiously, since the event had been televised all over Remnant. CCT reception is rather limited in Menagerie, dear, Callie said with a smile. The nearest support tower is on a small island between Mistral and Menagerie and is frequently down due to the tide, so what little access we have it reserved for our press and official contact with Mistral. That's not fair, she replied immediately. She knew from what Velvet had said about Menagerie having to rely on Mistral huntsmen that Menagerie didn't have many of the things that they took for granted, but the CCT towers were supposed to unite the world. For a whole continent to have barely any access to what had become an integral part of communication definitely wasn't right. How were they supposed to call for help when needed if their tower didn't even work properly? It's unfortunate, and something we are working to change, Gyra nodded. Though having a tower would also present some more issues, such as the buzzing they produce and the fact that they would attract more Grimm to the town. Now is not the time to lecture her on the ongoings of home, dear. You're right. He hummed and took a sip of his drink and returned his attention to his daughter. The important thing right now is that we have learned that both of our beliefs were wrong. With that understanding, our family can be whole again. Blake took a deep breath and nodded at her parents. I'd like that. Good. Gyra smiled, reaching out to take her hand. And I do understand how much these things must weigh on your mind, Blake, but believe me when I say that it is a good thing. It means you are remorseful for your actions. However, you cannot let that remorse consume you. Use it, understand it, and let it show you where you went wrong so that you can choose differently in the future. I know. Blake muttered into her tea. But what about being punished? After all I did, how can I just be free like this? How is that fair? Ruby watched Gyra and Callie exchange a look of uncertainty. Fair? Callie asked with a slight frown. You think it would be more fair for you to sit in a jail cell than to make amends by training to save the world? Blake shook her head, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Throwing caution to the wind, Ruby let go of the girl's hand and wrapped an arm around her shoulder. I don't know. Well, it is your choice to make. Blake's dad pet her hand gently. But think of how many people you have helped just last night by choosing Beacon, and how many more you could help by continuing. They're right, Blake, Ruby said in a comforting voice. You did some bad things, but jail is a place for criminals, and you're not one anymore. You want to help people now, and you can't do that in prison. You've already helped Patch by killing the Helk, and Linda by helping with the funeral. Blake didn't respond straight away. Instead, she continued to stare at her tea, the brown liquid reflecting the conflict in her amber eyes. Though Ruby knew she couldn't relate to everything Blake was going through, she knew what it was like to be filled with self-doubt. She had been herself after all when starting Beacon, especially when her plan against the Helk had failed, but with the help of her friends bringing her grades up and helping her to become a better leader, she'd learned how to deal with those doubts. Eventually, though, the girl let out a small sigh and pushed her drink away. "I need to think," she grumbled. "May I be excused?" "Of course, dear," Callie smiled. "We should probably talk to Saber anyway before it gets too late." Giving them all a nod, the girl stood up from the table and walked towards the exit. With a final look back at them that was filled with uncertainty, she left. While Ruby wanted to go after her, she knew her girlfriend wished to be left alone with her thoughts. "I'll get him for you," Ruby said, also wanting to leave the tent and avoid an awkward situation. "I should check on Yang too." "Thank you," Callie smiled at her. "And I hope we get to talk some more soon, Ruby." Her eyes widened slightly at the knowing smile on Callie's face, and she felt her cheek warm as she gave a nod. "And me too, miss. Callie." Receiving a nod from the woman, Ruby gave them both a wave and walked out of the tent. Just like she suspected, Blake was already gone, and she let out a low groan. She really wasn't sure what to make of Blake's parents. While they certainly seemed like good people who cared for their daughter, the fact that they would allow Blake to make such a mistake without trying to pull her back irked her. With how much pain it had caused, she couldn't help but believe that their parenting was wrong and more than a little negligent. But what was she to know? She wasn't a parent, and her dad had not exactly been the most strict person ever. Even Yang, who had been very overprotective, had at least allowed her to make her own choice and become a huntress, an extremely deadly job. But even still, they would have never let her get involved with people like the White Fang. So unsure what to think, she shook her head and made her way over to the cart to help Yang. Maybe fiddling with some wires would help clear her mind. Slumping down against a tree a few meters away from camp, Blake let out a gross sniffle and wiped her eyes. Despite it having been plentiful in the last year, especially in the last few weeks, she still really hated crying. It felt weak and stupid and very rarely made her feel better. However, after spending 5 hours recounting all of the atrocities she had committed and still having her parents welcome her back with open arms, she was having a lot of trouble making them stop. She had definitely not enjoyed telling the stories of her raids, nor of the grueling training that she had undergone at the camps, but there was also a sense of relief that had come with talking about it. Having spent a year internalizing everything, of never confident in anyone the full truth of what she had done and holding that shame close to her chest, to finally tell someone felt like a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulder. She was no longer dealing with it alone, and with how supportive they had been, Blake knew she could now turn to her parents or Ruby in the future. Though, that still didn't solve the feeling of feeling like she deserved more punishment for her actions. While she knew they were right about her contributing more at Beacon than she would in jail, Beacon still allowed her to be happy. Ruby, Yang, Weiss, even JNPR, they were all people that gave her moments where she could forget what she had done, where the faces of the people she'd hurt no longer haunted her. How was that right to those she had hurt, that she was allowed to live out her punishment in a place that made her happy? However, even as she thought about how leaving Beacon would mean leaving her team, or how to be unhappy in her punishment would mean no longer being with Ruby, Blake felt her desire for punishment falter. She considered it quite ironic. Despite having run away from so much in her life, and even having a semblance that allowed her to do so easier, she had finally found somewhere that she never wanted to leave. Not only for herself, but because she knew how much it would hurt the people she loved. So this dash. Blake started slightly and jumped to her feet. "What happened to you?" She recognized that voice. "Ilya?" Craning her head to look in the trees where she had heard the voice, Blake tried her best to spot her friend. Unfortunately, her camouflaging skills seemed to have improved since the last time they'd seen each other, and even with her night vision helping her, she was unable to spot the girl among the foliage. "So you do remember me?" the girl said again, her voice coming from a different part of the forest. Guilt rushed through her and forced her reply to be quiet. "Of course I do." "Well, you have a funny way of showing it." Spinning around to where the bitter voice came from, she was yet again met with nothing but an empty treetop. Not particularly in the mood for a drawn-out argument, she activated her aura and extended it out in search of her friends. However, To her surprise, she felt nothing. Nor did she hear breathing or footsteps when focusing her hearing. No goodbye, no note, nothing. The girl's voice spat angrily. I woke up and you were gone. Do you know how that feels? Blake let her gaze fall to the floor. I'm sorry. Still unable to feel any other presence than her own, Blake let out a quiet sigh and shut her eyes. It was an old trick, one they hadn't used in years, but she hoped the girl would remember. But you would have stopped me. A few seconds passed in silence, but Blake eventually felt an aura spark to life in front of her. Opening her eyes, she still couldn't see anything. She could finally hear the girl's soft breathing coming from a nearby tree. From throwing away everything we had worked so hard for? Equality. Justice. Our friendship. Before her eyes, the bark of the tree swirled like a whirlpool, quickly becoming a vibrant red. Small spots turned a bright yellow, and a golden trail ran down the tree to reveal Ilya's hair. Being up close for the first time in a year, Blake could tell the girl had grown. Not by much, but she was at least taller than Weiss now. The last time we talked you were heading off on a mission. The girl growled, her fists clenched at her side. But when Adam came back alone, he refused to tell me what happened, only that you were gone. I woke up every morning for weeks thinking you were dead, because nobody would tell me what happened. Because my only friend couldn't be bothered to say goodbye. Blake's eye fell to the ground again, as she saw blue begin to creep its way across Ilya's skin. I didn't mean for that. I just needed out Ilya. I couldn't do it anymore. The fighting, the ambushes, the raids, everything we dash was for the cause. The girl snapped, the blue immediately vanishing. Was to make lives for the faunus better. It wasn't though. She shook her head. You haven't seen it inside the kingdom's Ilya. Everything the White Fang is doing is just making life harder for us. You're just spreading mistrust. What I'm doing is only what was done to us. The girl snarled. Or has being friends with a Schnee made you forget all that? Lifting her head to look at her former friend, she saw a cruel look in the girl's eyes. She knew how Ilya felt about Schnees, and knew the reasoning for it, but she... Chapter 57, On the Road Again. I don't know, Weiss said with a shrug, typing on her scroll as she walked. It sounds like the perfect childhood to me. Letting out a small groan and shoving her hands into her pocket, Ruby shook her head. What was she thinking trying to talk about Blake's parents being too lax with their rules with Weiss? A girl whose upbringing had been nothing but rules that ultimately caused her to rebel. Of course, the heiress would side with Blake's parents. Yes, pretty perfect, she grumbled in adhesion, her brow falling into a scowl. Right up till they let you run away with a bunch of terrorists, so you can make mistakes that haunt you forever. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her best friend give her a curious look. I never thought I would see the day that you became the judgmental one, Weiss said with a hint of interest in her tone. This is the first time I have ever heard you talk about someone negatively. Looking at the front of the group where Blake was walking with her parents, Ruby let out a soft sigh. It wasn't like she didn't like them. In fact, they seemed really nice. But their parenting methodology was just something she couldn't wrap her head around. She had tried to understand it ever since the meeting, tried to see it from their point of view, yet even with sleep and half a day of traveling, she just couldn't. I just don't get why they didn't take her away from it, she breathed. How they can think it's a lesson you have to learn. All it did was make Blake hate herself. Returning to her scroll, Weiss shook her head and continued to type away at whatever dust reaction she was documenting. It was pretty much all the girl did lately whenever they had a spare moment, but Ruby wasn't going to stop her. Unlike homework and studying, it was something Weiss seemed to genuinely enjoy doing, and something that she herself, and a few others at school, had already benefited from. You seem to be forgetting that Blake was angry at them, and chose to wear her ribbon to disassociate herself from her family, Weiss said impassively. Had they actually came for her, it could have simply driven her even further away. How do you know that's why she wore it? September 22nd, 2010. Weiss recounted absent-mindedly. I'm tired of all the looks, tired of being referred to as the girl whose parents abandoned the cause. I didn't choose it, I wish they hadn't chosen it. But they did. They left us, too scared to do what needs to be done. But I'm not, and my friends need to know that. And if that means hiding my ears, then so be it. Oh, Ruby hummed, surprised that Weiss had memorized it. I haven't read that far back. Well, you should, Weiss said pointedly. They are not the most enjoyable thing to read, but they will help you understand why they chose to give her space. I know enough about Blake's past. Ruby pouted, not having the slightest desire to visit a past that was no longer relevant to who Blake was now. They still could have tried. Well, it's not like they can go back in time and change that now, Weiss said with a finality to her tone. Understanding that the conversation was over, Ruby shook her head and looked towards the belladonnas again. Just as they'd been the entire time they had been in the camp, Blake's ears were flat against her head as she talked to her parents. She had tried to comfort her a little last night when she had returned from her turn on patrol, but she'd been even more down than usual and insisted that she simply wanted to sleep, though Ruby knew for a fact that the faunus had yet again spent most of the night awake. Sadly, she knew there was little more she could do for the girl. Blake knew she was willing to listen if she needed to talk, and at every given opportunity would provide comfort, but given that they were no longer at camp and on their way to Secure, she doubted either of those things would be happening for at least a few days. So with a sad sigh to herself, she turned away from her girlfriend and turned to check on the rest of the convoy. It was always a peculiar feeling to have a summon out. Despite being on the road and mid-conversation with her partner, she could feel it out of there. 20 meters to the east running through the woods was a piece of her soul in the form of a Beowulf. While she couldn't see what it saw or hear what it heard, she could feel each leaf that passed over its fur. She could feel the ground under its paws and wind across its face. With all of that sensory information being processed, it usually made multitasking rather difficult. As such, whenever she had a summon out and scouting the area, she had taken to adding more information to her pet project. There was something about working out dust equations and logging the results that made it easier to focus on her surroundings. However, maintaining 3 things at once was particularly draining, so as Ruby finally fell silent and moved away to check on the rest of the group, Weiss let out a relieved breath. It wasn't that she didn't understand why Ruby felt the way she did, because she did, but that unlike her partner, the situation was more complicated than simply being something she didn't like. Not only were there cultural differences, but there was also the very strained relationship that Ruby simply couldn't understand. She had been lucky and grew up with a family she had always wanted to be around. They loved each other deeply and very rarely disagreed on anything more than who was at fault for a smashed cup, but that wasn't a luxury that everyone had. She didn't understand how trying to keep someone close when they didn't want to be could actually push them further away because, though she might not like it, Callie and Gyra were right. Some things just had to be experienced firsthand to be understood. And Weiss had been unfortunate enough to experience it all. Growing up, every attempt to engage her mother had only pushed the woman further towards another bottle. Every attempt to talk to her brother ended in them both saying mean and hurtful words or a door slamming in one of their faces. Even outside of her family, Weiss faced the same problem with the faunus. Due to her name and actions she had taken in the past, there was so much raw pain there that she would never be able to simply tell them that she was different and demand they trust her. If things were that easy, then she wouldn't have spent the past 2 days walking around the camp with her head down trying to avoid bringing any attention to herself. Not that it helped much, as pretty much every faunus at the camp had taken to giving her a wide berth. In fact, the only one that didn't was a girl that she recognized from a picture in one of Blake's diaries. Instead, the girl pretended she wasn't there so much that she refused to move out of the way when they crossed, forcing Weiss to move aside or collide with her. That pain was not something that vanished with a big speech or a show of force. It took time and many little steps that slowly built trust and respect. Steps that Weiss knew Blake's parents had been taking in the background in hopes that Blake could hear them and understand she was forgiven. Just because they hadn't marched into camp and demanded their daughter return home, that didn't mean they hadn't tried to bring her back. And that was what Weiss knew Ruby needed to realize instead of simply passing judgment on them for acting differently to how she would have liked. I just hope she realizes that before she says something stupid, Weiss thought to herself. After all, she knew the kind of anger that ran through Ruby's family, and people who were unfamiliar with that kind of feeling usually never let it out in the healthiest of ways. I should probably talk to Yang about it. Deciding that was a good idea, she saved her file and shut the program down and opened a reminder for later that night when they were camping. However, before she could finish typing the memo, a new sensation washed over her body, and she fell to her knees coughing and spluttering as the taste of ash and fire filled her mouth. It was so strong that she felt her eyes water and bob build at the back of her throat. No, it wasn't her throat. Wise! She heard Ruby, and saw the girl skid to kneel at her side. Wah dash! She was cut off as a loud howl echoed through the area. Allie? Gree! Wise coughed, reaching out for her partner's hand. As she did, she felt a sharp sensation in her back, and the connection to her summon faded, the howl ending abruptly. Gramercy coming! You should come and see it this year. Huh? Blake asked, feeling a little guilty for having tuned her mom out. For the last 20 minutes, she had only been paying partial attention to what the woman had been saying, as something else had been garnering her attention. A few feet away, Ruby and Weiss were having what seemed to be a heated discussion from the tone of their voices. Unfortunately, they were speaking at lesion, so Blake wasn't able to make out most of it. No doubt a purposeful decision, as they tended to use it for more private conversations. But there were a few words she could identify, the most prominent of which being her own name. The other was one she had heard Weiss use regularly in bitter tones, which she was pretty sure meant parents. With a few other words she had picked up from living with the pair, though, it was pretty obvious that they were talking about Gyra and Callie, and even though she didn't know exactly what was being said about them, she had a pretty good idea. After all, she had definitely noticed Ruby's reaction the night before. It had actually made her quite happy to hear Ruby talking back to her parents, though. Not because she thought they deserved it, but because it was the first time she had ever heard Ruby challenge someone else's authority directly, and she had done it for her. As rough as the day had been, the fact that Ruby cared so much for her that she was willing to talk back to adults had reignited a warmth in her chest. The Flower Festival, Callie repeated with a smile. It's next month. That's right, she thought to herself. With it being so long since she'd been home, she'd completely forgotten that the Flower Festival was coming up. It was a shame, since she remembered loving it as a child. With all the flowers and wreaths, the island became a swirl of color and beauty that had rivaled Ruby's brightest smile. Oh, Blake hummed. And maybe you could bring Ruby too, if you would like, Callie said with a sly grin. She seems to really like you. Was this really the conversation they were going to have after 5 years apart? I really like her too. How long have you two been together? 3 months. Maybe a little more. And she treats you well? Better than I deserve. I doubt that is true. Blake felt the hand that was in her grip a little tighter, and turned to see her mom smiling at her. It is, she grumbled, her eyes dropping to the floor. She's so good, and I'm also good. Her mom cut her off. You did what you did because you believed it to be helping your people. And when you learned your actions were not, you changed course to correct that mistake. That is a noble quality, one befitting a chiefess. Blake chose not to reply to that particular comment, as it was a conversation she was definitely not ready to have. While it was still a long time off, she knew that one day her dad would decide to pass down the position, just as her grandfather and her great-grandmother had before him. Being his only child, the position would naturally fall to her, and she was very aware that her dad had wanted her to accept it. Well, it doesn't feel like it, she sighed. It will one day, the woman said with a kind smile. But until that day, you must let people be there for you. Let them reaffirm what we know to be the truth. Callie reached out and brushed her fingers gently along the base of her ears, causing a comforting sensation through her body. That you are a good person. Blake didn't know if it was the fact that it had been said almost every hour for the past 2 days, or if it was the fact that her mom was saying so while soothing her, but she finally wanted to believe her. At the very least, she could agree that she had always tried to do good, even if her actions had been anything but. I will, she nodded, giving the woman her best attempt at a reassuring smile. Good, Callie said, a hint of relief in her voice. Now about the flow dash. Wise. Callie was cut off as Ruby's worried voice reached both of their ears. Turning around and drawing her weapon, she watched her girlfriend rushing to the Era's side, as a familiar howl echoed through the area. At the sound, every guard in the area drew their weapons and began to close ranks around the convoy. Mom! Get behind me! So if England was so great, why were you coming to Vale? Young chuckled at Prince's story, which had involved a girl, her brothers, police, and zero clothes on his part. Aw, you know, the man shrugged. Small town life's great, but it ain't exactly the most safe thing. Even for a port town with hunters coming and going, we could feel the grim closing in. Wanted to get Beans out of there. He's also trying to avoid Kabicha. Pettily, or Beans as her brother called her, said from her seat on the cart. The cart was pretty decent considering what had been left of the truck to work with, though she had definitely not had as much wire as she would have liked due to most of it being melted away by sentinel acid. The brakes and the bed had been in good enough condition for them to work something together. Weiss had also been able to provide some gravity crystals she had picked up in Zealand that had been attached to the bottom, and allowed Yang to pull every supply crate and suitcase with a single hand. Your ex? MHM. Prince nodded. She was. His eyes flicked back to his sister. Difficult. Been there. Yang chuckled. I like Park Hamill, Pettily said, pulling an apple from a crate and biting into it. He was nice. He was, Prince said. Too bad he couldn't stick around. What about you? Anyone waiting at home? Girlfriends. Yang smiled, digging out her scroll from her pocket and showing him a picture of Coco in velvet. Only been 3 days, and I miss them like crazy. No flirting, got it. He grinned mischievously. Pretty sure the Fern girl's got her eye on me anyway. Looking ahead to where the Fern family were walking, she saw their daughter look back at them and give him a soft smile. She couldn't even blame her since Prince was a rather good-looking guy. With his bright green eyes, eye-catching ginger hair, and a large amount of confidence that matched his outgoing personality, she knew he was definitely someone who would have caught her had they met a year ago. The only thing that she found questionable about him was his fashion sense, as a long orange cloak that was decorated with fabric sword tassels on one side didn't exactly seem comfortable given the warm weather. Pretty sure you'd end up with another situation like the girl and her brothers. Yang chuckled, having seen the girl's father giving Prince a disapproving look multiple times. You're probably right, he hummed thoughtfully. Enough about my love life, though. What's the deal with you lot? Been a lot of talk about your friend's return. Basic family reunion. Yang shrugged, not really wanting to tell a story that wasn't hers to tell. They had a falling out a while ago. Gotcha. The man nodded. She doesn't seem too happy about it, though. She is. Yang corrected him. That's just Blake. And like I said, they had a falling out, but I'm sure they'll be fine. Yang wished she was certain of that. While she was very aware that Blake loved her parents, she couldn't help but notice just how distressed the girl had been since meeting them. Instead of their presence reassuring her that she was a good person, it had only caused her to believe that she deserved her punishment to deepen. It had been especially painful last night when she had gone out to look for her and found her huddled against a tree talking about how she had done too much to make up for her. Unfortunately, the girl had risen her walls so high that all Yang had been able to do was convince her to go back to camp and go to bed. It hurt a little to know that the only thing she could do to help her best friend was to send her to see Ruby, but she supposed it was better than doing nothing. I suppose families all got their own ways of working their stuff out, Prince said with an accepting nod. Beans here just shouts at me. Because you deserve it, Pettily said, throwing the core of the apple at the back of his head. To Yang's surprise, Princeton's hand shot out with incredible speed and caught it. With the girl being less than a meter away and him not even turning around to see it, it was quite an impressive display of reflexes. With a smirk back at his little sister, he bit off a remaining piece of flesh and threw the core into the tree lean. Little sisters, he chuckled. Never appreciate what we do for them, huh? Tell me about it, Yang agreed jokingly. Blake's family are a little more complicated, though. Chief of Menagerie Dash. Wise. Yang heard her sister's voice just ahead of her and immediately pressed the brake lever. Thankfully, they worked, and the cart came to an immediate halt. Hearing Allie's howl sound through the area and letting go of it, she stepped to the side and watched Weiss being helped up to her feet. Once she was up, she drew her weapon and Yang instantly understood. Grim? She heard Prince ask, pulling a combat knife from a holster on his leg and handing it to his sister, who quickly crawled beneath a tarp in the back of the cart. Shaking her arms and causing her gauntlets to extend, she gave him a nod. Looks like it. Can you fight? I got some tricks up my sleeve. Good. Yang nodded and tapped her ear, turning on close-range comms and hearing her team's voice. Me and you will guard the cart.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.